Good morning, everybody. It's very nice having spent quite some time out of the superannuation fund community and working on sort of different projects, much more focused and certainly with far fewer direct constituents to manage. It's very nice to be back, and I'm particularly pleased to be able to be involved in this project. I'm doing it because I do think, unsurprisingly, I'm part of the 60% that really does have quite a strong conviction that this opportunity that we are presented through a combination of events is critically important for so many people, for those of us that work in the industry, but more importantly for those people whose savings we manage. And I appreciate that there is some fatigue starting to set in some quarters from those that have been involved in various, first of all, adapting to the number of changes that do seem to continuously wash over this sector. Those of you that were involved in making submissions to the original Cooper report, and of course here you are again dealing with another round of consultation on what to do with those recommendations. But I think it's important to recognise that government policy has been set on the back of the Cooper recommendations. There were some 187 recommendations by my count. Government explicitly rejected 25 of those, which leaves a little over 160 that they supported either strongly or supported in principle or noted in a positive way. And most of those came with the proviso that the industry would be, that stakeholders, but that's particularly the industry, would be consulted about the best way to implement that. So that's the good news. The tougher part, I guess, is that we've been set a very short time frame for that process. Our aim is to try and deliver a report to government by the middle of the year that to reflect the outcomes of the process, including the generous allocation of time that Angela referred to. That is ambitious, and realistically not all aspects of all recommendations can be dealt with in that time. So I'm trying to focus on what's most important. Government is keen to introduce legislation later this year. As you know, it is the government's intention to increase the contribution rate, and the Minister has made it quite clear in a number of speeches that on the back of that, this is time for the sector to look deeply and honestly at the way it does things, to listen to the observations made as a result of the Cooper report that there is scope for improvement, and to try and constructively work together on delivering a mechanism for that improvement to be observed. So that's why I'm here. I've got some particular aspects of interest, and there are parts of the process which many of you have spoken to me about over the last day or so, where I appreciate that there is detail and then another layer of detail, and devil's buried at every single level within that. So we cannot hope to achieve everything now, but I would like to make sure that we lay the foundations of a new and improved system by the time as part of our report by mid-year. Some of you did have the opportunity to listen yesterday to a couple of the representatives from Treasury who are really working on this. If I could just take the chance before I begin talking a little bit about the practicalities there. Treasury is the Minister's confidential advisor. Treasury will provide its advice to the Minister on the best way to implement the stronger super reforms. My job, and the job of the Peak Consultative Group, is to make sure that there's a document produced that will be available publicly that does represent the stakeholders' consensus view on the best way forward. Where we can't achieve consensus, we'll record our differences, although I've made it quite clear to people that from a government's perspective, a constructive consensus opinion is a lot easier to work with than people in corners and disagreeing with each other and leaving the government in the position of having to determine the way forward. We will do our best to achieve consensus. Where that's not able to be done, I will record difference. That document will then form part of Treasury's advice to the Minister, and ultimately legislation will be produced. I intend to protect the integrity of that process very clearly. I will make sure that the views of stakeholders, including the industry, are faithfully and fearlessly represented. I will make sure that the Minister is aware of those. But to be fair, where I think that the industry, where we perhaps haven't risen to the standard that we need and haven't worked hard to try and achieve a constructive consensus for them, I will give my suggestions as to one way that they might be able to resolve those differences. So I do welcome the engagement of people in that, and I do reinforce the need for us to try and set aside some of the differences that do plague us and work together to deliver the government a way forward to achieve some of these things. So Basically, the government concluded in its response to the Cooper Review, and some of you may have read this completely, others may have just simply looked at the size of the pack and moved on. But it really, as far as I can see, there were 4 key conclusions. They did conclude, or Cooper concluded, and the government supported the view, that there is room for improvement in the integrity of the fast-growing self-managed superannuation fund sector. It's a third of the assets and growing fast. That sector is here to stay. There is increasing professionalisation in it, but government is interested in ways of endorsing that, particularly through the auditor scheme. So one of the streams that we're dealing with here is that I appreciate that doesn't involve any or many people in the room, and I don't intend to say much more about it, but it certainly and formally endorses and recognises the role of the self-managed superannuation fund sector in the industry. It also recognised that there was room for improvement in the processing of contributions and money as we, in the superannuation system. This has almost unanimous support, although probably is the area where there is the greatest degree of complexity in terms of implementation. A lot of people have been working on this project to date, and many more will be involved in the future. Government has indicated that it expects these initiatives to be fully in place by 2015, with a series of milestones between now and then. A lot of people are working on it, and I'm becoming increasingly aware of some of the subtle features around that, but we will be working diligently on that. And again, I don't intend to say too much more about that today in the interest of time. There are 2 other areas, though, where the government supported or endorsed the conclusions of the Cooper report, and that is that there is scope for further improvement in the efficient and prudent governance of superannuation funds, and I'd like to come back to that in a moment. And further, and finally, that there is scope to improve the experience of the very significant proportion of contributing workers in the country who are members of the default fund in their workplace. So it's those last 2 areas that I'd like to speak briefly on today, and then I'd like to see if we can allow 10 or so minutes for questions, because I think there are so many questions about this. So let's look at those, taking the last one first. Government has decided to introduce MySuper. It will come, it's expected to appear in legislation later this year. The opportunity that we have as part of this process is to define exactly what that is. I'm trying to make sure that as much common sense as possible prevails, but that is not a reason to say, and this is one area where I would say, there was, I think, a starting position that surely this wouldn't involve very much change at all. Surely largely the way we did things could be just managed to fit into whatever MySuper needed to be, and things could move on. I think there's a positive aspect of that. That is, the last thing this sector needs is more compliance and more rules and more new hoops to jump through. Unless those hoops, we can have a high degree of conviction will result in a better outcome for the people whose savings that we manage. And I think there are some aspects of that, and I'd like to touch on it. So I will be prosecuting very, very keenly the sense that we do not need more complexity for the sake of it here. We do not need more rules that would in any way diminish the offer that we make to people. But I do think buried in the recommendations on MySuper, there are some really positive features, and I'd like to just draw your attention to those. So, as has been indicated a number of times, a lot of people are working on this. There are a series of working groups who feed their views through to a peak group. Ultimately, my job, and AIST is represented on that, as is the Industry Superannuation Network, as is the Financial Services Council, and a range of other people from employer groups and trade unions and various other representatives who are part of the system, including consumers who have a voice at this council as well. So let's think a little bit about what some of these things are trying to achieve. In respect to governance, as I indicated, one of the areas I'd like to touch on, as I indicated before, that 25 of the recommendations were rejected. 3 or 4 of those were specifically in relation to governance, and clearly the government did not accept the view of the Cooper panel that there should be a mandatory dilution of the equal representation process in the trustee governance system. It did not accept the recommendation that where equal representation was the model used for trustees, that there should be mandatory non-associated directors to work alongside those equal represented directors. So that's a clear endorsement of a system which I think has, and all of you involved can feel justifiably proud of the fact that we have protected what I call the moral integrity of our savings system. We have not seen fraudulent treatment of any money, and we've seen diligent and careful and honest governance of the money that we have been entrusted to. But that does not mean that there's not further scope for improvement, and the government, in rejecting those, quite clearly accepted that there is room for making the governance of funds more accountable and efficient. It particularly focused and endorsed the suggestion that a code of governance be developed for trustees of superannuation funds. You'd be aware that presently a number of codes exist for each different part of the community. I think it's quite clear that we're being asked to produce a universal code that will apply across the sector. There is some variety of views around that, whether that should be voluntary, reflecting the different conditions that exist in each fund, or whether that should be mandatory, or whether it's some combination of both. Certainly, I think the regulators would prefer some form of mandated code, accepting that there may be aspects of that which sit alongside that in rather more of a voluntary code. That is a key, that is an outcome which does need to be delivered as a result of this process. People are working on it now, and I commend those people involved, including the people representing many of you here, for their commitment to that project. The report does go through and indicate a number of areas that might cover, and some of you may be familiar with that, but it does talk about the different obligations of the chair as opposed to other directors. It does talk about a need for boards to think about what is the optimum size for their organisation, to have a broad enough range of skills without becoming so large that they're unwieldy. It does talk about ask boards to consider what is the appropriate tenure of directors, what the individual and collective skill set of those directors should be. It does suggest that it should be required that boards conduct an annual review of their performance, including their ability to meet the objectives that they've set for the people whose savings they manage. It does talk about standards for service provider selection and the way that is done. Now, the government's not mandated these, but they have accepted that they are useful guidelines to what might be considered in a code. Again, I just say that that's work on the table, and I think that you will no doubt be hearing more about that as that starts to develop. But government has made it clear that it does expect best practice in the governance from superannuation funds. It does, I think, accept the growing body of work that there is a link between the quality of governance of a pool of money and the outcomes that are produced. And surely quality of governance is a combination of the right degree of alignment between the people managing money, responsible for overseeing the management of other people's money, and the interests of those whose money they manage. And I think that many of you can feel extremely proud of that degree of alignment. They also say that those people, as well as bringing that highly aligned status, needs to be competent and sufficiently experienced with a wide range of skills, and I think that the Code of Governance will probably address that. But that's always worth thinking about, and I think that one of the opportunities that comes through as I move on to My Super, which is the other bold initiative, and again I would expect that this will be featured in legislation later this year, as I think My Super represents a wonderful opportunity to sweep up so many of the aspects that have been included in the Cooper Review and try and codify them and have them introduced to try and improve our system. Realistically, there has been some confusion about what My Super represents. The growing view of the consultation process is that My Super is not a person, it's not a member, it's not about whether they're engaged or not, it's about the experience that people have when they are in the default investment option of a default fund. So it's been recognised as part of the Cooper Review that so many people, approximately half the money in the non-SMSF superannuation system is sitting in the default strategies, and much of that would be in the default fund for people. So a very large proportion of the assets that we manage belong to those people who are in the default investment option of their default funds. That is the My Super market. That is the group that government has said it wants particular attention paid to ensure that there is a minimum level of experience that those people have of the superannuation system. There has been quite a lot of focus on cost reduction in that, and there are a variety of views on that. But I think it's important to read further than the headlines here. Government's real focus in terms of their response to the Cooper report is that what needs to be emphasised is the delivery of value for money for members. And it goes on to say that trustees' obligations must be on the net returns provided to members. And I think there's a lot in that. And I would very much I've encouraged the people involved in the process, and I would encourage you as interested parties, not to fall into the trap of thinking that this is about delivering the lowest cost product and stripping away some of the features of the current programs that you offer to try and effectively manage money for people. That is inconsistent, I think, with the concept of value for money, particularly when we start to look at costs in a triangle of the return that we are seeking and the risk that we are managing against. And I would very, very much like to see my super rep be an opportunity for an industry that has, over the last 5 to 10 years, in response to various initiatives, and in particular to the growing competitive pressure that exists in the marketplace, I would very much like to see whether we couldn't collectively use my super as a chance just to reduce the focus on peer risk management, short-term competitive pressures, and think about whether it represents, as part of the further recommendations that are required on trustees, to be explicit about the return that they are trying to achieve and be clear with people about the risk that they are managing. If we couldn't see this as a chance to just reframe the offer that we make for all of those people who are trusting us through the default system to manage their welfare for them. These are the people who very much have the view that we are the experts. They are putting their savings in our hands, and they expect us to be thinking about what kind of outcome that they want. And therefore, I think it's a chance for us to say, is there anything about the way that we currently manage this money? We are all, after all, agents in a process. We all, while we approach this with the right intentions, in most cases, it's easy to get distracted by issues that affect our business, our share of the market. We worry about our competitive position, and I think that there's a wonderful opportunity here to just step back from that a little bit, to be more explicit about the kind of return that we are trying to seek for people and state that more clearly. I think it often sits within trustee statements, but is sometimes not particularly well managed to, and certainly not well communicated to. I think alongside that is a chance to be much more explicit about the risk that we are taking to achieve that. And I think that there's a lot we could do a lot better than collectively we do at the moment about the way that we articulate the risk that we are managing for people, and more importantly about the way that we manage to that. I think that competitive pressures can certainly distract us from that, but I do really see wonderful scope here for just making that a much crisper project so that people around a board table, people working in the staff of funds, can align themselves around that and report that more confidently and more clearly to members. And I think that if it's clear, if we have this relationship, a clearer relationship in terms of the offer that we're making for these people as part of the MySuper experience, I do wonder if that might not reduce some of the things that do distract us along the way. I'd be happy to take any questions about that. And then I think it's a chance to think about the cost that we incur. There are some fairly extravagant statements made in the report about the size of savings. I certainly think that there is some scope for savings in the way that we run funds. I think it's interesting to ask, it's certainly a question I've asked myself in some of the roles that I've been doing in the last, over the last decade. Do we as a sector overbuy? Do we spend our money in the wrong place when we're designing investment programs? Do we spend enough on the development of strategy? And I suggest perhaps we don't. And do we spend too much on implementing it? So I think that this is an opportunity, as well as part of the requirement to build our justification for the cost that we incur from bottom up, to go back and ask ourselves whether we are focusing in the right place. There is, of course, mention about performance fees, and even a suggestion that performance fees should not be used for default for default members unless they comply with the standard. I think we need to do more work on that to try and understand exactly what the issue that was detected is. I think, we all know the story that performance fees can be an excellent way of achieving alignment with the agents that we appoint to manage our money. Poorly constructed, of course, it can end up with more loss on the side of the governor than the implementer. There is, of course, a rather vexed and an important issue around the role of financial advice to members of this. And simultaneous to this process, there is the future of financial advice reforms going on. The government will announce their conclusions there, I think, next month. And I appreciate that there's been a great deal of energy expended on exactly what would constitute intra-fund advice and what would be allowable under this model. That is something of a wait-and-see space. Certainly for myself, I'm waiting to see what the FOFA outcomes are and what the government announces there. But I do recognise clearly that while a key initiative of MySuper has been to design a product which does not include charges for services which many people do not utilise, and advice is one area that's clearly singled out there, there is a need for people to be able to meaningfully engage with people in a way that can work for them. And that's a balancing act for us. Clearly there's a policy decision that we cannot include the cost of quite comprehensive advice in default products. If people wish to avail themselves of that, there is an expectation that they will, and there's certainly no discouragement from them doing that, but there is a sense that they need to be prepared one way or another to pay for that rather than have that cost shared amongst all the people of the default strategy. This will be a subtle process to balance, and much more can be done on that, but you can expect you've got some very forceful and faithful representation on the issue around the table, and we are trying to work out a common sense approach to that. I think it's important to state here that government is, every indication I've had from the Minister and more broadly, is that government is vitally and keenly and genuinely interested in the outcomes that we produce. They are expecting us to be faithful to the policy objectives that they've set, to be faithful to the requirement to ask ourselves, is there a way of improving in general the way we govern these pools of money, to be faithful to the concept of saying we want a better value for money program for those people who are in the default strategies of default funds. They are listening to us in terms of how we can achieve that. They expect us to make progress on it. They do not expect us to come back and say we couldn't think of anything that could be done better. So I'm working with the group to try and tease those issues out. I'm certainly encouraging them where there are differences to try and work to come up with a central view. As I said before, we may not be able to achieve that in all areas, but what I absolutely do know is that is far more valued by government and its advisors as part of this process than a restatement of differences. So I would conclude trying to leave some time, a few minutes for questions, to say, to thank you for your endorsement of the fact that this does represent a wonderful opportunity. I'm committing my time to it because I genuinely believe that it does. I think that, as the Minister said last night, we should not let lack of vision, lack of courage, or even, in a much quieter voice, self-interest stop us from trying to deal with this issue head on. It's been a long time coming. We've had compulsory super now for 20 years. This is really a wonderful opportunity to reframe the offer that we make, to reconfirm our commitment to the mission that so many of us articulate. This is about a better deal for the people whose money we manage, particularly the half of all the money that is for people who are in every sense trusting us to deliver us with an outcome. If we can along the way remove some of the blind spots that we've built up over time, some of the practices that have become just the way we do things, if we can attach a commitment to try and review those as part of MySuper, I think that would be a fantastic initiative and something that we could see come to light in legislation later this year. Thanks.